So in the first video on chapter 2, we looked at declaring variables and the variable namespace. And now we're going to look at the kinds of things that you can do with variables. And we're also going to look at some of the features of PyCharm and some tricks and tips for using PyCharm. So I've decided that when I first opened this project, I called it variables, but I think maybe I want to rename it chapter 1. So I'm going to right click on the name variables and go to refactor, and under refactor, rename, and I want to rename the project, and I'm going to call it chapter 1, or not chapter 1, chapter 2. And then I'm going to put in a new script file for the second part of this video, so var part 2. And notice that both of these files are now part of this project for chapter 2. Okay, so now I'm going to declare a float variable, pi, and we're going to have a radius r. So let's say that the radius is 4. And now we're going to define the area. So the area is pi times r squared. Now in a lot of languages you define an exponent with a caret symbol, but you notice that in, well, I don't know if you can see this well or not, but in Python this is actually underlined, meaning Python doesn't recognize it. So the way you do exponents in Python is you do a double star. So that's the area is pi r squared, and we can do the circumference, and that's 2 times pi times r, and then why am I getting a problem with circumference? Typo. Yeah. And then we can print those out. So we're going to print out r and the area and the circumference. And notice I put spaces after the commas. If you don't do that, then you're just asking to get a pep. And we don't like peps. I like to keep this right hand side here nice and clean, as pep free as possible. Actually, so it's giving me a hassle about the way I've spelled circumference with a C-I-R-C. So I'm going to show you another feature of PyCharm. I'm going to right click on that, and I'm going to do the refactor again. And the reason why this is called refactor is because you can use a name in programming languages in multiple spots. So for example, when I refactored the name of this project, you could actually use this project in another project. And so when you rename it, PyCharm actually checks to see other places where you've used the name and changes them there too. So for example, I'm going to refactor the name circ, and I'm going to call it circumference, and refactor, and see it changed it in both places. Now you may have noticed that I misspelled pi up here. I actually did that on purpose because I was going to refactor it also, but the circumference thing was convenient enough. So there's a nice feature, especially when you start writing longer programs. You may decide that you want to change the name of a variable, and that variable could be in 20 different places, and having to track those all, I mean, you can use find, but tracking those down, find, replace, is kind of a pain. So it's nice to be able to just right click, refactor, rename, and it will search all the way through your code to see where that variable's at. And notice here I did something with the print statement where I am printing 3 separate things all in one print statement. So I'm going to run this, and we get 3 different outputs. The difference between doing it this way and this way And notice also that PyCharm does what's called code completion. So I start typing circumference, and it recognizes that of all the variables that I have declared, if I start with CIR, circumference is the only one left. We can just fill that in, and we can run it again. So the difference between having the print statement with all three variables listed in it versus having three separate print statements is every time you execute a print statement, it prints a new line. So this print statement, the first one, prints a new line, and then this print statement prints out R, which is 4, new line. This print statement prints out area, which is 50.265, blah, 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 new line. This print statement prints out the circumference, and new line, and then it finishes, and it should finish with an exit code of 0. Notice I'm getting a PEP, or had a PEP. It says no new line at end of file, and I was getting a little squiggle down here. So if you just go ahead and hit enter at the end of your very last line, then you get rid of that PEP. Okay. So with numbers, whether they be floats or integers, you can multiply them, you can add them, you can do exponents with them, you can do the normal sorts of arithmetic. They also follow PEMDAS, so they follow the orders of operations. And then we've mentioned this in class, but we'll say it again. You can also do operations with strings. I can print string 1, string 2, and then I can print string 1 plus string 2. So you can add two strings together, and when you do that, you get what's called a string concatenation, which means that we're going to put those two strings together, one after the other. So we'll run this, and we get hello world. So this is hello, this is world, and then hello world is these two together. So notice it puts the hello world together right next to each other with no space in between. When you put a comma like this, then it automatically puts a space in between whatever you're printing out. So it did the same thing up here when we printed R, area, and circumference. It put a space between those values so that you could see which one was which. And it does the same thing with the strings. It prints hello. The print statement automatically puts a space in there. It's print string 2. The print statement automatically puts a space, and then puts the prints the concatenation of string 1 and string 2, which just means that you put string 2 at the very end of string 1 and put them together. Now if I wanted to, I could put a space in between these by putting another string in between. That's a space, and the simplest way to do that is you just put a space string in here and put a plus. And maybe we'll just do that by itself. Run it again. So there are operations that you can do on strings, and one of them is plus. We're going to see in a later video you can actually do a multiplication with a string and do some interesting things with that. Okay, at this point, what have we seen so far? Well, we've seen some features of PyCharm, particularly in terms of renaming variables and projects. It's found out by right-click and refactor. We've looked at a little bit more arithmetic using numbers. In particular, we showed you how to do exponents, which is a double star, not a caret symbol. We learned a little bit more about print, in that you can print multiple things in one print statement. And we revisited this idea of using a plus sign with strings. Now, there's one more thing that I want to talk about, and that is how you do comments in Python. So a comment is something that you put in your code to give somebody that's looking at your code an idea of what you're doing. So I'm going to put a comment, and in Python, comments start with a pound sign. So let's see, what's this comment going to say? This code shows how to use what? arithmetic operations with, man, if I could type, numbers and strings. And then you can also put a comment in a line if you want. That probably doesn't need documenting, but we could. Notice I got a pep. If you put too much space in there, it's going to complain and say, hey, you're only supposed to have one space after your comment symbol. Can I tell you, Python coders are fussy. You can actually use comments in another way. So as soon as you put a pound sign, anything that follows that is going to be considered to be a comment. And what that means is when a translator comes in and looks at your code, it ignores anything after a pound sign on that line. So it's going to ignore this entire line. It's going to ignore this entire line. It'll come in and read the pi equals 3.14159, get to the pound sign and ignore everything after that on this line. Then I'll go to the next line, read r equals 4, and so on. So the comment operation is used actually in a couple different ways. One is to comment your code, but another way it's used is to take out code that you don't want to see right now. So suppose that I was working with the hello world stuff and I got sick of seeing the print r, the area circumference. So the way to get rid of that is if you put a pound sign in front of it, it becomes a comment. Notice how it's grayed out. So I don't want to get rid of that code because I might need it later, or maybe I've got this part of the code working and I want to test this code, but I don't want to see the output of this. So you can comment it out. And then when you run it, all you see is the hello world part. And then if you need this code back, you can come back and just go ahead and uncomment it. Okay, so that is it for this video. Again, a quick review. We looked at changing the names of variables. It's a refactor, and PyCharm goes through and checks all of your code for that variable and checks all dependencies on that. It does a lot of work for you. We looked at doing arithmetic, looked a little bit more at strings, and we looked at comments.